George Carlin grew up in Manhattan, Morningside Heights on the west side of the island, in the specific working-class New York of the late 1940s and 1950s. Streets and stickball, and a neighborhood that provided, as neighborhoods of that kind often do, both the material for a lifetime of observation and the urgency to leave. He left at 17 to join the Air Force. He left the Air Force at 21 and ended up, through the particular logic of military service and its aftermath, in Fort Worth, Texas. Fort Worth was not where anyone expected him to become George Carlin. It was not where he expected it to happen either. It happened anyway. The radio station where he found work in 1959 was KXOL. He had been working in radio since the Air Force, developing the voice work and the timing and the ability to fill time with material that the medium required. Fort Worth was a continuation of that, not an obvious launching pad for a career in stand-up comedy. It was a city in northern Texas, far from the New York clubs and the Los Angeles television industry that shaped American comedy, populated by people and sensibilities that were entirely different from what he had grown up with. This turned out to be useful. One of the things that makes comedy work is distance. The comedian's ability to look at something from outside it and see the gap between what it is and what it presents itself as. Carlin had grown up inside New York, which gave him the material of that specific world, but not necessarily the perspective on it. Fort Worth provided perspective. He was genuinely outside the world he was from. He could see it from a distance for the first time. The other thing Fort Worth gave him was Brenda. He met her at KXOL. She was working there too, a young woman from Shreveport who had arrived in Fort Worth by a route as particular and unlikely as his own. They recognized each other with the specific quickness of people who are going to be important to each other. They were together within months. They were married in 1961, before either of them had left Fort Worth for the career that was coming. The third thing Fort Worth gave him was Jack Burns. Burns was from Buffalo, New York, and had arrived in Fort Worth through Air Force service of his own. He and Carlin met, recognized each other's sense of humor with the immediacy that genuine comedy partnerships require, and started performing together. The duo that would become the Burns and Carlin Act was conceived in Fort Worth, rehearsed in Fort Worth, and first performed for Fort Worth audiences who had no particular reason to know they were watching the beginning of something. The city was incidental to all three of these things, in the sense that any specific place is incidental. The meetings that happened in Fort Worth could have happened elsewhere, in other configurations, at other times. But they happened there. The specific combination of Brenda and Burns and the distance from New York that Fort Worth provided occurred in Fort Worth in 1959 and 1960 and 1961. And the combination of those three things was the material from which the first George Carlin was made. The clubs where he and Burns first performed together were nothing special. Small venues, local audiences, the kind of rooms where a working comedian could develop material without the pressure of a national profile to protect or a television deal to maintain. This was valuable. The pressure-free context of the Fort Worth club circuit allowed experiments that might have been too risky in New York or Los Angeles. Bits that did not work, approaches that turned out to be dead ends. The gradual process of finding what was actually funny rather than what was supposed to be funny. He left Fort Worth in 1962. He went to New York with Brenda, and the beginning of a solo act and the collaboration with Burns still in progress. The career that followed, The Tonight Show and Ed Sullivan, and the growing national profile and the transformation and the HBO specials, began, in the cleanest sense, when he arrived in New York with what Fort Worth had given him. He rarely spoke about Fort Worth directly. It was not the origin story he told most often, perhaps because it was too specific and too accidental to make a clean narrative. The narrative that he was a New York comedian, a product of the streets and the wit and the specific aggression of working-class Manhattan, was more coherent and more marketable, and not wrong exactly. He was a New York comedian. He had also been a Fort Worth comedian first, and the Fort Worth version of him had been important to the New York version in ways that were real even when they were not visible. Brenda stayed. She stayed for 36 years until the cancer took her in 1997. The relationship that had started in a radio station in Fort Worth was the structurally central relationship of his adult life, the one that held the household together through the transformation and the drug years and the financial collapse and the rebuilding. Whatever Fort Worth was, it had been the place where that began, and the beginning was consequential enough to matter for the next 4 decades. Burns went his own way after the split in 1962, eventually to a long career in television. The partnership that had started in a Fort Worth club ended, but the things it had taught Carlin about collaboration and about his own instincts were not lost when the collaboration ended. You learn what you are by working with someone else. The learning stays after the partner leaves. George Carlin grew up in Manhattan. He became who he was in Fort Worth. The career that followed, the transformation, the HBO specials, the 50 years of material that audiences are still quoting, traces back in a straight line to a radio station in northern Texas where a 22-year-old from Morningside Heights showed up and stayed long enough to find the things he needed. He did not know, when he arrived in Fort Worth, that this was where it started. Nobody ever knows that about the places where things start. He found out later. The way you find out later is, you look back and you see that this was where the thread began.